Welcome to the astrology interview, and I'm Sue Brain, and I am delighted to be welcoming Ray Grasse. Ray has been studying astrology for the past 50 years. He's written 10 books, and he's the most fantastic photographer. Is what behind you, is that part of your photography, Ray, your background?
No, this is a screensaver that comes with Zoom. So no.
Okay, but it looks pretty impressive anyway. You look like
Yeah, I
you're
wish I
sitting in the
took it.
middle middle of a rainforest.
Yeah.
Anyway, Ray and I have decided because we're so old, we're
Yeah.
very well, I'm certainly a late bloomer, that we're going to be talking about astrology and late bloomers. So, Ray, you've written a lot about this. You've written a lot about the impact of Saturn on our charts. So I'm definitely going to be asking you about that. And then maybe we'll just open it up a little bit more to look at other possibilities that come up in the chart to
Right.
explain late bloomers. So, why have you been so interested in this? Because you've written quite a few articles on it.
That's a good question. I suppose it's because it's been such a part of my life. I have Saturn in the first house, conjuncting my moon and Neptune, trining my Saturn, Venus, Mercury. Saturn's all over my chart, and that's just for starters. And my life has been very much that slow developing energy. But I've also, in studying the charts of others, time and again, I've seen there is this dynamic to Saturn that is often overlooked, which is that over time it unfolds in a very powerful way. It can be for better or worse, but you take, for example, Frank Lloyd Wright, who was born with Saturn on the ascendant opposing Venus near the descendant. And the Saturn Venus clearly was behind his architectural genius, his awareness of form and aesthetics and structure with architecture. It also gave rise to a very checkered love life and romantic life. But the thing that really stood out for me, and I grew up basically around his home in Oak Park, Illinois. I walked past his private studio every day on the way to high school, and Ernest Hemingway's house as well. They were very close to each other, both late bloomers in a strange sort of way. Ernest
Yeah,
quite differently than him. But Frank Lloyd Wright had his most successful phase starting around the age of 69.
yeah.
And from 69 till 90, he just was incredibly famous and successful. He made a lot more money. His life unfolded at that late an age. And right before that happened, him and his wife were basically destitute in his 60s. And you see this energy, this kind of dynamic with Saturn, where there can be radical shifts in the person's life. But if a person knows how to work with the Saturn, there can be the late bloomer thing where they wind up as they get older becoming very powerful in a certain way or very successful. And I go through in my essay about it in terms of Saturn, Sun, Saturn, Mars, Saturn,
Yeah.
Mercury, and how you see that dynamic so forcefully, vividly in the charts of people that have strong Saturn connections.
But surely it has to get triggered. I mean, we talked about this before we started recording, didn't we? We've had an
Yeah.
email exchange about this because I'm really fascinated about the progressed sun's moon cycle in older people. Like if there's a new moon, let's say in your late 60s, you're going to be climbing up that hill again. And if you've got a full moon, progress moon, you're more, you're entering the waning phase. And I wonder if it'd be so interesting to see in his chart whether that had happened for him. Something must trigger it. That's late in life.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, that could be triggered by any number of things, although it could be just triggered by getting older, because I do think that different stages of your life activate different energies. For example, a person who's 10 years old is going to activate a different moon than a person who's 70 years old. You resonate to the moon differently as a 10-year-old than you do as a 60 or 70-year-old. And I think that also applies to progressed aspects.
Yes,
So that's one part of it. But I also think transits could obviously factor into it
sure.
in other ways too. If you let's say you have a progressed new moon, when Uranus is on your ascendant, that's going to be very different than if you have a progress new moon when Saturn's on your ascendant.
Sure.
So there's a lot of factors I think that can factor into that.
Mm. But it's interesting, isn't it, that
Yeah,
yeah, I work with, older people often. I mean, younger ones as well. But I'm very always interested when it's older because I'm curious about what stage their progressed moon cycle is in.
right,
And definitely the ones who are much more engaged are definitely in a new progressed moon phase rather than the ones that are beginning to sort of, yeah, experience life in a different way if they've had a full moon, a progressed moon phase.
right. Well, and there
It's a
are,
theme, isn't it?
yeah. And I think that it's not just the progressed moon, but it's a number of things. For example, someone having, Jupiter cross their sun at
Yeah,
70 is going to have a new phase opening up.
yeah,
And if they also happen to have a progress new moon at the same time, that's like a double whammy. And maybe they might
yeah.
have Uranus trining their Mercury. There's a lot of factors that signify, I think, the opening up of and closing off of phases in a person's life, of which the progress moon is just one of those.
Yes, because it's so I always look for like two or three factors,
Yeah,
proving that
I
support
agree.
each other. But I'm curious because I was with an older woman the other day, and her entire relationship with life was this dreading old age, dreading it rather than being engaged with it, and
Right.
this sort of quite depressive tendencies. So I didn't actually see her. She wasn't a client. I was just talking to her, and I just felt so different. Because for me, it's just like this is so exciting. This older
Yeah.
phase, never been there before. So I'm just curious about how we relate to it. And is that late blooming or what would you call it?
There's many factors here. And there's also the spiritual factor, or a person that's been eating junk food and eating Big Macs their whole life is going to approach old age very differently than someone that has been doing yoga and eating healthy their whole life, in addition to the horoscope. So I think that you can affect how your horoscope manifests just through practical measures in terms of your
Mm,
lifestyle. But,
mm.
like I have even though my Saturn is very strong, there's a bunch of trines to it. And my older years have been much nicer. They're not perfect, but they're much nicer than my younger years were. And I think that certainly makes a big difference. And you see that in the charts of,
Yeah.
like you take Saturn trine Venus, even people that don't live long, like Princess Di, in her later years, even though there were problems even in her later years. It was clearly a blossoming that was taking place after that
Yes.
very difficult marriage. Or you look at the singer Tina Turner,
Yeah. Oh
who
my
she
gosh,
had a
yeah.
Saturn trine Venus as well. And so she had this horrendous marriage to Ike Turner early in life and was basically poverty stricken, even though they were making money as musicians. And then she married this wealthy European and had the end of her life much, much better. And so, in some cases, you can attribute it to, I think, something like a Saturn trine or sextile or even a conjunction. But in
Yeah.
other cases, you'll even see people sometimes with squares to Saturn that blossom later. It really depends on so many factors. George Harrison of the Beatles had Saturn square Sun. He didn't live long, unfortunately, but he really blossomed. His career really took off later in terms of his personal creativity.
And also both of them, spiritual development. I mean, Tina Turner was a Buddhist.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, and George Harrison certainly found himself after he'd gone to India to the ashram. There was a huge blossoming for him spiritually, and apparently he was. I've never met him, but I know people who did, and just said he was just delightful
Yeah.
because he kind of lost the ego, that sort of the sense of how important I think people who blossom late, now you might correct me on this, have a very sort of healthy relationship with what it's all about.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. I think
Uh,
that, yeah, the attitude factor, it, yeah, I'm not sure what to add to that, but I agree with that.
yeah, I had a very interesting experience. I have a chap came to trim a couple of trees in my garden, and he was meant to be bringing somebody with him to help him, and he turned up on his own. I said, "Oh, what's happened to the person that you're bringing with you?" And he said, "I can't get him to work. In fact, I can't get anyone. I'm willing to train anyone who'll come, but they all want to be on their iPhones and become YouTube influencers." And I think there is something here about the younger generation, and I don't want to not all the younger generation because there's fabulous people out there, but there is this tendency of wanting to escape a lot, not
Yeah.
wanting to grow up.
Yeah. It's kind of, to some extent, the dark side of the Aquarian Age, if indeed you subscribe to that idea. I do
Yeah.
personally, but I do think that, every era and every age has its highest and lowest potentials. So on the one hand, the Piscean Age gave us, Jesus Christ and Saint Francis, but it also gave us Torquemada of the Inquisition and so on and so forth. And
Yeah.
likewise, the Aquarian Age, whether you regard that as a real phenomena or simply as a helpful metaphor, is an age when, yes, you will have Einsteins and Steve Jobs and, whatever other Stephen Hawking's, but you're also going to have the masses glued to their smartphones, caught up in trivial data and information overload. We're seeing, I think, that disproportion already. Yeah, that's what I would add to that.
I mean, it's interesting as well because, of course, Aquarius is ruled by Saturn, you know,
Co-ruled, I would say,
oh,
co-ruled.
and Uranus. So, do you
Yes,
want to talk a little bit about that? Because I think that's such
yes,
a fascinating combination, considering Jupiter is the son of Saturn and
yes.
overruled him, and they're the social planet. So, please, talk a little bit about that.
I could go on at length, but I'll try to keep it brief. I think that there are strange similarities between Saturn and Uranus. They're both very cool planets, and they both are very into limitations. And what I mean is, if you meet someone that has, let's say, the moon conjuncting Neptune versus the moon conjuncting Uranus, the moon conjuncting Neptune is very leaky boundaries. It's very amorphous. It's hard for them to know where to put boundaries because they meld in with others. I've got a moon, Neptune, Saturn myself, but moon Uranus is very independent. They have very stark boundaries up, very freedom oriented. Don't get too close to me. That's very similar to Saturn moon. Saturn moon also has boundaries up. They both are, they're very structured in their own way, even though Uranus has great differences with Saturn. And
Mm.
I don't want to get into the chakra side of this too much. That's too much into the weeds. But they both relate to factors of time. They both relate to science and to material plane pursuits. What I mean is, I've done charts for a lot of scientists, and they usually have either a very strong Saturn or a very strong Uranus. Okay, it's usually one of those two planets. There might be other things involved, like Jupiter or Neptune, but you take, let's say, Saturn would be more like Isaac Newton. He had Saturn square Mercury, like old school mechanistic
Yeah.
science, whereas Uranus is scientific and it's the physical world, but it has more to do with like quantum. It's more dealing with the complexities of time and of space and all that sort of thing. But I think there is much more of a link between Saturn and Uranus than people realize in that respect. I don't know if that's answering your question or not.
Absolutely. Well, it's, I think for Aquarians, it's one foot in the past with or the tradition with Saturn, and then this visionary part of that's what I see.
Yes,
Uranus is visionary and sudden insights and downloads and futuristic. And of course, Saturn is very much linked to, well, let's do it slowly and carefully.
yes,
And that's why I think we're living in this time where, there is a sort of, there is, how do we handle this? There's this pull
yeah,
to the past of tradition and this very strong pull to the future. How do we create this utopian vision that we're all imagining, but not actually creating it?
right.
We're not.
Yeah. I've written about individuals like Bob Dylan or Sting, and how they have very strong Saturn Uranus. Like Bob Dylan has his moon between Saturn and Uranus, and Sting, like myself and David Byrne, and probably yourself, have Saturn square Uranus. And with artists and musicians who have very strong Saturn Uranus, they're trying to bring together the past and the future, like Bob Dylan using traditional folk forms in music, but also kind of pushing the envelope in lyrics and arrangements. Same with Sting, staying with a lot of other musicians. And I think to a certain extent, that's emblematic of all of us right now. To what degree do we conserve the past? To what degree do we push into the future? And those artists, I think, are kind of exemplifying that for us.
They were kind of forerunners, though, weren't they?
Yeah,
Because I think there were yeah, that's how I look at a lot of this great changeover that's been happening. We've had a lot of forerunners. I don't know if that's the right word for them, but visionaries. But now,
yes,
we're all going off the end of the conveyor belt. We're all heading that way pretty
yes,
quickly.
yes.
But who is following up behind with how are they going to handle this very strong Aquarian energy and with Pluto out of bounds?
Yeah, we're at a very precarious tipping point, especially with AI, artificial intelligence. And now with Uranus, Uranus is coming up to return to its discovery point, 1781, around 24 degrees Gemini. It's exact in 2031. And now we've got the Pluto in Aquarius, which is, on top of that, trining Uranus, curiously enough. So there is a lot going on that signifies this tectonic shift right now. And it's anybody's bet which way it could go, but I do have concerns with AI in the next few years in terms of whether we're going to be able to keep a lid on it. And especially as we get up to the exact return to the discovery point in 2030 and 2031. Is it going to be what science fiction writers have referred to as the rise of the machines? Is it going to put everybody out of work except for a handful of people? Um, you know, what's going to happen with the ET question or the UAP UFO question? I think that's a big part of it in terms of like 1947, within virtually a
Yeah.
few days of the second Uranus return to the discovery point was the Roswell
Yeah.
incident and the Kenneth Arnold incident. So I do think we're
Yeah.
heading into a new phase with regards to anomalies and aliens and non-human intelligence is maybe the better word.
Yeah. Now, we were talking about Dan Waits before we started. So he's
Yes.
talking a lot about that on World Astrology Report. So I found that really interesting. And I just want to go back to this whole concept of late bloomers because the fact that I feel that humanity is so fractured at the moment and so kind of in a way lost. There's a vision going on, definitely, but the reality is that we're not. I don't think we're doing very well as a humanity, and what's happening to us as in our blooming. Are we regressing, or are we sort of proceeding? Are we finding are we finding the way? And I just wanted to ask you about that. I don't
Big
know.
question. That's a big question.
Hmm. And astrologically, particularly, obviously.
Yeah. Um, Whenever there is, if you read about, there are books about chaos dynamics in physics, and there are these shift points when there is chaos before a new order arises. Now, when you see that chaos as one, level of organization changes to another one, is that good or bad? It's
Mm,
not really either. It could go either way. And I think that we're at this point of chaos where we're trying to find our way. It's, I think, far too early to really tell, but it's, boy, that's a tough question to answer. I don't know how to answer it simply. I think that some people, like in any major historical shift, I think some people are level-headed and keep on course with their personal vision,
yeah.
and other people get caught up in the mass sort of
Yeah.
consciousness of chaos.
Yes.
It always comes back to the individual in terms of are you
Yeah.
caught up in the drama, or can you remain somewhat stable in yourself in the midst of it? It all depends on the individual. Carl Jung made the statement about what is it? I can't remember the exact quote, but um, when you get caught up in the collective, the individual, I forgive me, I can't remember the quote,
Yeah.
but it's
Mm.
maybe you know what I'm getting at.
I
It's
do. I do. And I think a lot, I'm where I'm concerned is the fact that we're living in this time of celebrity, youth obsessed Western culture. And this is not encouraging us to take responsibility for who we are and our evolution of our soul's journey. I don't think. I feel like it's stultifying actually with a lot of people. I'm not saying everyone, but I do see that. And I was thinking about this and about how we've lost community. And of course, when we did have community, however difficult it was living in community, there was a structure to community, and the young people had older generations and they were all known to each other. So everybody had to take some form of responsibility. They had a place. And I don't see that anymore. And that concerns me.
with any major cultural or societal change, there is the good and the bad. And what I mean by that is, on the one hand, this chaos that we see uh, is producing a regression for many people because they're losing that sense of community and structure and ritual sort of initiations, etc. But on the other hand, the very fact of that chaos means that an individual can forge their own path and draw from all the different sources that are available now. So it's going to be, I think, a regressive thing for most people, but for some of us, this is an extraordinary window of opportunity for the creative individual to draw
Yeah.
upon these different sources and forge a new vision.
Yes, but where is the mentoring?
Yeah, a good question. Where is the mentoring?
And I think the other thing is, and certainly I've seen it when I've been over to the East, I've traveled a lot in Asia, and they do have such a strong sense of family. I'm not saying it's all roses at all, but there is this sense of respect for older people. And when I was in India, they were calling me auntie, which was just so sweet. Hello, auntie. I love that. but you don't get that here in the West,
Well,
the Western culture, and I just feel like there is, and it's everywhere. And I don't want to knock anyone for doing what they're doing, but I find it really distressing that people are so obsessed. Young people are so obsessed with their looks because of celebrity culture that at very young ages now they're having Botox
right.
and
Yeah.
nails out here and goodness knows what. And there's this desire to look the same. And I worry that troubles me.
Is that totally new, however? Because I do remember when we were young and I had long hair, and the old folks were criticizing me, saying, "You just want to be like everybody else. You grow your hair long, you know." And you go back to the time of Socrates,
Yes.
and or the talk about the corruption of the youth, and they're not paying attention to the wise elders anymore. So
Yeah.
it's the more things change, it's a little hard to say. It is, I think, aggravated now. There's no question,
Yeah.
but I think we'll come out of it okay. But it may be a very rough ride until the dust settles.
Yeah. Ray, I'm also curious about this a poor energy or the
Yeah,
puer energy, which
right.
or the concept that's the psychological concept that really describes the sort of the Peter Pan kind of character. The person that never wants to grow up, who doesn't want to grow old. And I mean, I suppose you could sort of name an archetype of Michael Jackson. He seemed to be fit very well into that energy. And I just wondered where you are in that, in the whole late bloomer and astrology. Um, does everyone late bloom? Can a puer energy or a puer energy late bloom? Or do they always do they just remain in that archetype?
That's a good question. Um, without getting too political here, I mean, here in America, we're dealing with some political leaders who are quite old and yet still act like 12-year-olds. And can you chalk that up to a certain pattern in the chart? I mean, it's generally associated with Mercury and Gemini, and it
Yeah.
is interesting that the political leader I'm thinking of is a
Yeah.
Gemini. So
Yes.
maybe
Very.
that's,
With Uranus in there, I think, isn't it?
yes,
Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
indeed,
Yeah.
indeed. So I do think there are certain archetypes, especially, Mercury and Gemini, but Michael Jackson, it wasn't either Gemini or I don't remember what his Mercury was. I think there's many factors that can go into that. I don't have a simple answer for that. It's an important question. Um,
I'm
yeah,
just wondering, for instance, a more youthful person, I'm going to chuck this at you and just see.
yes,
Obviously, Gemini Sun, Gemini Rising, Gemini Moon, and Mercury, obviously a strong Mercury, maybe. I was also thinking about Sagittarius,
yeah,
very strong Jupiter, that the enthusiasm of Jupiter, possibly who doesn't want to grow up. And then
Aries as well, I would say.
Aries, yes, yes. And then I was thinking about Libra because they're always wanting to please people. So that,
Ah,
and I just
yeah.
wondered what you feel, where you were with that.
I think that's all accurate. It depends on the horoscope, of course. But like if I just recently wrote something up about Marlon Brando's horoscope. He was born on a sun moon conjunction in Aries.
Uh-huh.
And even though he was quite a profound and brilliantly talented individual in a lot of ways, he was very childlike even when he was older and never quite grew up. And similar to Orson Welles, who grew up
Yeah,
early but wound up, he's a complicated instance, Saturn, Pluto on the ascendant in Gemini, curiously enough. And so I don't think there's a singular pattern, but I think it can be due to a number of different things. Um, Yeah, again, I don't have a simple answer, but I think Libra, Sagittarius, Aries,
Yeah.
Gemini as zodiacal archetypes do
Archetypes,
factor in
yes.
there.
Yeah. And the other thing I was thinking about as well is this whole concept that some people bloom very early. They
Yes,
kind of, their star, I always look at it as their star shines. I think everyone's star shines at some point, maybe
yes,
for 2 minutes, but there is this spent, where you reach the zenith of who you're going to be.
right.
It's often, from what I've noticed, is people that bloom very early, they tend to kind of just burn themselves out.
Yeah,
And then what happens?
right. And then you have some instances like Shirley Temple,
Yes,
who she was very famous at a very
yeah,
young age, and yet she wound up becoming a ambassador, I guess it was, at an older age. So it was a
yes,
late bloomer, but in a different way. And you'll
yes,
often see the late bloomer thing manifest in terms of like a person may be successful in their 20s, like the Beatles, for instance, and yet they continue to ripen in terms of spirituality or intellectually. Like David Bowie,
yeah,
for example, he had a sun, yeah, a moon, Saturn, Pluto conjunction in Leo, which is on the, I think, the seventh house cusp, if I'm right, which is a difficult pattern for a young
yeah,
person. But he was very successful at a young age, and yet when you see the interviews with him when he's older, he matured very profoundly. He got off of drugs and alcohol, and you see those interviews with him, and there's a lot of depth and a lot of maturity
yeah,
there.
yeah,
If and that was because he chose to, I think, quit the substance abuse. If he hadn't have quit the substance abuse, which is a conscious choice on his part, I think that it would not have turned into a late bloomer thing. It would have gone the other direction into a tailspin. So much depends on the individual free will and choice, I think, of the individual in terms of which way they're going to take that late bloomer potential.
that's an interesting one. And I suppose with Pluto on the descendant, I mean, that's, the one of the major angles. He would have to have gone through some form of transformation, whether
Yeah.
it was death through drugs, that's a transformation, or it's what he chose to do, which was to transform himself and his relationships, because then he married, I think it was Angie, wasn't it? I
Uh,
can't remember the name of his.
well, there was Angie, but then there was Iman.
And Iman, that's right. That's
Yeah.
right.
And
Yeah.
that seemed to have been a stabilizing influence. So
Yeah.
that was kind of the positive side of the Saturn Pluto
Yes.
moon, because she, in a way, was very Saturn Pluto moon in terms of tall and dark and from Africa and all that.
Yeah.
So, Angie had a very different, I don't mean this in a negative way, but had a
Yeah.
very different synastry in his life than, let's
Mm.
say, Iman did.
Okay, I want to talk about late blooming and the planets on the angles,
Okay.
because I think, in my understanding of the angles, when you have a planet on there, they're always going to play out very strongly in your life.
Yeah.
So again, I guess it depends on when they're triggered, or how you are in your personality as well. I mean, obviously, it's all free will as well, or some of it's free will. That's another conversation
Yeah.
to have,
That's
because
another conversation.
I'm so confused about that one. I can't tell you. But can you just talk a little bit about, yeah, planets on the angles and how they can play out as we grow older?
Yeah, I think, and I just finished an article on planets on the angles for Victor. Um, I think that each of the angles has a different significance, of course, but not just in terms of content and themes, but in terms of timing. So, for example, planets that are on the ascendant tend to manifest the earliest in life to some extent, whereas a planet, let's say on the 10th house cusp, tends to manifest later. I've seen charts of a lot of people who had a planet, let's say Jupiter on the 10th house cusp, the
Yeah.
midheaven, and uh, they were 25 years old and they had some good luck, but they didn't feel like anything had really happened. And then I did a chart for them 20 years later, and things had really blossomed. And likewise, a person might have Jupiter on the seventh house cusp, or no, take Warren Beatty has Saturn in the seventh house. And he was notoriously commitment phobic when he was younger. And then I think he was around 50 when he finally got
Yeah.
married, and he's still married.
Yes.
That Saturn manifested very differently for him when he was younger, as this,
Mhm.
having the walls up and not wanting a negativity about marriage. And then as he got older, it kicked in as a commitment energy of wanting to be married. I think that as you get older, you manifest those energies in quite different ways depending on your maturity and your own frequency, so to speak.
Yeah.
Um, but planets on the angles, the more I've done astrology, the more I've come to believe that they are the defining factor in a horoscope. It's like one of my original astrology teachers said that a person might have Mercury right on the angle, and that will supersede some squares in the second house or eighth house. And I recently read Liz Green says something quite similar. So, and I find that to be true. It's when
Yeah.
you look at a chart, there are two defining factors for me when I first look at a chart. The one is, are there planets on the angles? Because they are going to be incredibly important in that person's life, presuming you know the birth time, of course. And the other one is, what are the closest aspects in the chart?
Yeah.
Because especially the hard angles, the squares, the oppositions, and the conjunctions, you could almost read an entire chart just on those factors, the angular planets, if there are any, and the closest aspects. It's the person will be drawn towards those. Those will be the most important planets, most important factors in the chart in terms of manifestational energies. I'm not sure if
Mm.
I'm touching on your question there.
No, no, I think that's absolutely. And again, when they get triggered at different parts of our life. Now, the other thing I wanted to talk to you about was particularly, well, Uranus we know goes around the chart in 84 days. 84 days. Ha!
Yeah.
84 years. We're heading to ours.
Yeah.
But I'm very interested in the cycle of Neptune and the cycle of Pluto, particularly, because they only ever hit part of our lives. And I wondered how that plays out again at late bloomers. Or I'll give you an example. So I'll have to give you my own example. So I've got Neptune in the 11th, and it's now in it's just going over my IC at the moment. So that's my experience. 11, 12, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Pluto in the ninth house, and it's now in my third house. So it's traveled just to that. That's all. I've never had either of them going over the until now the IC and going up through the seventh, eighth, and eighth houses, sixth, seventh, and eighth houses. And how do you feel about that? Do you feel like there is? Do you feel like we've just come here to have a transformation in just part of our lives? Do you see where I'm coming from with this?
I'm not sure. I have plenty to say. I think I know what you're getting at, but it when you have planetary returns or half returns or quarter returns or planets like Pluto or Neptune crossing the angles, etc., it all does funnel back to the natal chart in terms of the potentials. The old adage that only that can happen what's printed in the natal chart.
Yes.
And I think there's a
Yes.
lot of truth to that to some extent. And so take, for example, Meghan Markle. When Pluto squared her natal Pluto in the fourth house, what happened? Her father appeared out of nowhere and started being in the papers all over the place talking about his estrangement from Meghan. And it had to have been very embarrassing for Meghan and the royal family. That's a classic Pluto kind of shadow energy coming back up into the present that you haven't been facing. But she had Pluto in the fourth house, I believe.
Mm.
So it triggered an energy that's always been there as a seed potential. And so these planets come along
Yeah.
and they trigger the seed potentials. Or you take, for example, the singer James Brown. I believe it was this movie came out about his life. I forget the name, and I think it was sit step out, no, something. I can't remember the title of the movie, but it came out under his Neptune half return, I guess it was. And he died around the same time as I recall. It Get On Down, I think, might have been the
Mm,
movie's name,
mm.
something like that. And it brought to a head these patterns like the half returns or the returns, if you're old enough to experience Uranus, for instance. They resurrect primary primal themes in the birth chart, which in the case of Pluto might be transformational, but again, it depends on what you do with it. So take Meghan Markle. Now, I don't remember how she dealt with that whole thing with her father, but now you can either just pretend, theoretically speaking, you can ignore it and try to push it away and not deal with it, which I think makes it metastasize. Or you can kind of find a way of integrating that energy because Pluto in the fourth means you're somehow probably not integrating something from your past. It might be a wound from your past, maybe a
Okay.
past life, shame issues, very often. So again, free will or conscious choice makes all the difference of whether an energy will be transformational or constipational, if I can put it that way.
Yes, lovely. I love
You
it.
know?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm just interested that, especially with Pluto and Uranus, we only have it traveling around part of our chart, not the
Yes.
whole of it.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
You see what I mean? And that's what I'm just curious about that and the choice of, if we did choose the time of our birth, I don't know if we did, then it's very influential about how that's going to play out in some of your chart, but it isn't going to touch unless it's an opposition or a square. It's not going to touch quite a lot of houses and
Yeah,
theme.
I had not thought of that. That's a really interesting point. I hadn't given that any thought. But again, I do think it comes back to the natal chart, so
Yeah,
that even if those planets are starting to move into a quadrant of the chart that has not been activated with that planet, it still will resurrect whatever
yeah,
energies are there in the birth chart.
yeah,
I always bring it back to the birth chart, even though it will factor in through like
yeah, yeah.
the way you're saying, but I need to think about that some more. That's a really interesting,
No, it just struck me.
point. Yeah.
Oh, um, to finish off, Ray, I just want to I was thinking about my parents and late blooming. And of course, they didn't have an opportunity to late bloom because they were all in the war. All of them.
Yeah.
They were all
Yeah.
deeply, deeply affected by war, by death, by loss, by grief. Didn't talk about it because it wasn't done in those days. But they definitely were very responsible, or that was a theme in certainly in my parents' life, and I think in most of my generation or our generation's parents' life. I don't know what it was like in America because, I mean, obviously, my parents being in Britain, it was that's what happened. We were bombed, and I wonder about generational responsibilities and bloomings and late bloomings, or yeah, I mean, we're the Pluto in Leo generation. And I don't know,
Yeah.
but I mean, compared with our parents, my God, I had a wild time. I
Yes.
only grew up much later.
It, I would ask a question, a rhetorical question. Why is it some people came through the war in England and were broken by it, and others wound up standing taller as a result? Was it because, let's say, one person might have had Saturn trine Pluto versus Saturn square Pluto on their birth chart? Is it because of,
Mm.
some other spiritual factors? Not everybody was some people were late bloomers as a result of the war. Some people, well, of course, died, but then others were
Yeah.
crippled by it emotionally.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
again, it comes down to the individual to a great extent in terms of whether they became late bloomers or late, what would be a comparable word, late, I can't think of a term
Yeah.
offhand, but you know what I mean.
Yeah. I think it's
Um,
taking responsibility, isn't it? Or whatever
yeah,
responsibility means.
right. I mean, you might see if you had come to me in the 30s and you showed me two charts of individuals, and the one chart had a really sturdy, kind of strong Saturn and strong Pluto or whatever it might be. And another chart maybe had a bunch of Neptune squares and Pisces energies or Sagittarius energy. I don't know. I mean, I
Yeah.
don't want to oversimplify it. But I think that you might be able to predict which people would come out of the war stronger and which people might be
Yeah.
broken by it.
And
You
maybe
know,
people with a fixed chart are more resilient and more
that's a good
willing
point.
to, you know.
Yeah.
I just want to ask you something about that, the fixed chart, because I read something not so long ago about the esoteric understanding of the fixed chart, saying the fixed chart represents the cross of suffering. You have to enter into the human condition. It's not an option not to run away with a fixed chart.
It's an
Do you,
interesting idea. I
yeah,
don't
I
know.
just,
I don't know if I buy that. Um, boy, I've
mm,
always associated suffering in my own worldview with the Pisces Virgo axis, that polarity. But I can see why someone might say that about the fixed sign. But again, like you touched on yourself, some of the people I know with the strongest fixed charts had the strongest resilience. They suffered less than someone that might be, heavy, Virgo Pisces or whatever it might
yeah.
be, or they did not. Yeah, but for instance, you'll see a chart like I do occasionally that is nothing but trines and sextiles. Then you'll see a chart with a grand cross. Now, which of those charts is going to weather the storm better? The charts that I have done for people who are all trines and sextiles, they have it so easy
Mm,
that when things go to hell, they don't know how to cope with it because they haven't
yeah,
had to deal with trauma or crises or true challenges. Whereas the Grand Cross person has had nothing but their whole
nothing
life.
but. It's like,
And
oh God,
I
here we
mean,
go again.
I've
Yeah.
had family members like that. So again, this gets into a lot of interesting nuances.
Fascinating, isn't it? I mean, this is what I love about astrology. Just, light the touch paper and off we go.
Yes. Yeah.
Great. Is there anything else you'd like to say just to finish off?
Well, we have this Saturn Neptune coming up, which is a classic example of what we're talking about to some extent. Why is it some people
Mm,
will resonate to it in terms of the angst and the suffering and the woe is me, self pity sort of thing? And other individuals are going to rise to the challenge, and it could produce extraordinary artistic creativity. You see Saturn, Neptune in the charts of brilliant composers like Mozart, or great humanitarians like Abraham Lincoln, I suppose. But and Dalai Lama might be a better example. This is going to be a time when the rubber meets the road in terms of how we respond to the energy. Do you have a creative or spiritual way to sublimate or redirect that Saturn Neptune? Now, mind you, even if you do, there may still be challenges, but that
mm,
it's
mm.
very different to have no outlets or creative outlets for resolution, even in the midst of those challenges. Some people just they
Yeah.
don't have, I can't imagine not having a creative or a spiritual outlet or being able to go out in nature. Those things help me keep my
Yeah.
sanity, taking
Yeah.
photographs or whatever.
Yeah. And I think, a lot of people are going to get depressed, because it's hard. And if you don't have a creative outlet, or as you say, or you're not in tune with the natural rhythms of life, or nature, as you say, doing your photography, that's challenging.
Well, take
Yeah.
1989, the week that Saturn exactly conjuncted Neptune in November of 1989. I had two major traumatic events happen. I won't go into the details of that. But in retrospect, I can see they were very good. It was for the better. And at the time, I was able to have enough of, I think, a philosophical or spiritual perspective that I could allow for that possibility, as painful as those situations were. And having that perspective astrologically, that there might be
Yeah.
some, you know, longer term, late blooming potential. Because I do think maybe it's because of my natal chart, but I do think these difficult challenges ultimately work out for the better in the long run if we allow them to and don't just drink ourselves into oblivion and jump off the nearest, bridge.
Absolutely. Well, we've all got to just buckle down, really, and just see what happens.
Yes. And there are great things. There's the grand
Yeah.
sextile happening now with Pluto
Yeah,
trining
absolutely.
Uranus and
Yeah.
sextiling Saturn, Neptune. So there's huge potential like you had in 1943 and 1944 with the similar grand sextile that gave birth to people like Joni Mitchell and Jimi Hendrix and Mick Jagger and all that. So, and that was in the midst of a horrendous world war. So I
Yeah.
think that there's always that
Yeah.
window there if you can find it.
I think it's just lovely to think about the women who are pregnant at the moment and the babies who are just born at the moment, how they're going to move up in life, what
Yes.
they're going to give us. I think that's
Yes.
really exciting to
Yes.
think like that with this combination
I
naturally in
agree.
their charts. Ray, thank you so much. I have thoroughly enjoyed talking to you. Yes, and I'll put Ray's information below this video so you can get in touch with him then. So for
Okay.
now, until the next time, thanks very much and see
Thank you.
you
Appreciate
later.
it.
Bye all.